My name is Dwayne Howell. I'm Professor Emeritus of Old Testament and Hebrew at Council University in Campbellsville, Kentucky. Just dropped my pointer. Also, retired pastor. Pastored about 30 years in Central Kentucky. Enjoyed immensely that opportunity. I want to talk today about victim blaming and using the David and Bathsheba narrative as an example of that. This article that this is based on is on this issue of Priscilla Papers, if you want to follow it. Let me also share with you afterwards, in order to save trees, I didn't copy off all this, but if you'd like the selected bibliography I have, as well as the PowerPoints, I'll have my email address. Just send an email to me and I'll send those right back to you. Well, the origins of this study has sort of an ignoble beginning. A few years ago, online, there was a discussion among Old Testament colleagues about Bathsheba's role in the David narrative here. It was on that important site, Facebook. And of course, I got to looking at it and think, well, I wrote my dissertation on David. I'll just put my 2 cents in work. You know, every 30 years you need to refer to your dissertation. But I got to thinking, why is it that we have to blame Bathsheba in order to save David? And then I began noticing that the same thing happens in institutions. We blame the victim instead in order to save the institution. And I began looking at this and looking at how we can look closely at this David and Bathsheba narrative to better understand it. The way I'm approaching it here is a literary approach, looking at how the characters are developed, the emphasis of the writer. One of my basic arguments is that the narrator tells you how to retell the story by the clues he or she gives in that story. So let's look at this. The David and Bathsheba narrative begins in 2 Samuel 11. It technically goes over into chapter 12 when Nathan confronts David. But this narrative begins in chapter 11. And from the very start, we are told who the main character is. It centers around verse 1. And if you see that there, it states there, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with them. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. From the very start, we're told that David's going to be the center of this narrative, because David's not where kings normally are. Now, the narrator never tells us why David doesn't go into battle. We're just told that David's not where he normally is. In the midst of doing this, we see how the story in centering on David goes on and begins talking about how David's walking on his porch, looking over his kingdom, because the palace set above the other houses. He looked above his kingdom and saw a woman bathing, and she was beautiful. Please realize the place that you bathed at that time was in the back courtyard. Bathsheba was in an appropriate place, and we'll find out later that she's cleansing from her period during this time. What David is doing is wrong. You are to avert your gaze. But what does it say? David saw her and saw that she was beautiful. He kept looking at her. So again, the fact that David is not doing what he should be doing. Then David sent someone to inquire about who this woman is. And the verb sent throughout this passage in chapter 11 centers primarily on David's actions and the character's response to David's actions. He sent and inquired. Then he sent a messenger to find Bathsheba and bring her to his palace. And then David lay with Bathsheba, lay with her. Not that they laid together, but he laid with her. Again, the whole emphasis of this narrative is on David's actions. Now, as I mentioned here already, the verb sent is a very important verb throughout this story. Look what happens. David sent for her. Look what she does. She sent a message. I'm pregnant. And that's often how it turns around. David's actions are met with these reactions. When he sends the murder, really the death warrant in Uriah's own head to go to the front to Joab and have Joab kill him, Joab sends a message to David. But the most important response to David's actions is in chapter 12, verse 1. And that is, the Lord sent Nathan. In response to all of David's sending in chapter 11, God responds by sending Nathan to confront David with his sin. So again, as you can see here, the emphasis is on David's actions throughout this narrative. Everything that happens is because of David. What about Bathsheba? Well, it's interesting how Bathsheba is used throughout Samuel and Kings. These two sets of books are related together. Kings is sort of the sequel to Samuel. When we see Bathsheba, she's what we consider a passive character. We're not told about her inner motives. We're not told anything about what motivates her or what she thinks. She is primarily acted upon. When we are told who she is told, we are told that it is relationship to men, to her father, Eliam, to her husband, Uriah. And when we look at when Bathsheba is referred to in the 3 times in Samuel and Kings, it's always being acted upon by men. First off, David acting upon her. Then later on in chapter 1 of 1 Kings, it's Nathan who acts upon her. Nathan wants Solomon to be king. But David's first son that's still surviving is Adonijah. Adonijah's already proclaimed himself king. He's celebrating on the hillside. And so what Nathan does is he goes to Bathsheba and tells her to go in and tell David that he had promised it to Solomon. This is all being told on Nathan's part. We're not told anything that first off, that was even true. It's simply that Nathan wants Solomon on the throne and uses Bathsheba to get that accomplished. And then finally, who I've mentioned already, Adonijah, realizing that he will not be king, he makes a request to Solomon through Bathsheba to provide one concubine from David's harem to him, Abishag. Now that seems awful strange, but do realize what Adonijah is doing here is he wants to be king himself. And if you have any possession of the harem, you have claim to the throne. And if you know what happened to Adonijah after this, Solomon kills him. But he used Bathsheba to get to Solomon. So really, Bathsheba is just a passive character in these stories. She is acted upon. We need to remember that when we think about the role that Bathsheba plays in looking through historical reaccounts of this. In the later writings, one of the best books I found in doing my research is Bathsheba Survives by Susan Koenig. She takes every writing there is about Bathsheba from the early church leaders all the way through to the 20th and 21st centuries, and how Bathsheba is viewed in those writings. And what she found is the earlier writings, the writings of the church fathers and the church mothers, emphasize really a benevolent view toward Bathsheba. But as male leadership became more important in the church, we find that Bathsheba becomes the seductress, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. If you look at the paintings of Bathsheba during that time, they are very provocative paintings. And that for the reason she's very beautiful, and she used her beauty to tempt David. Again, the blame goes on her. And we can even go to 1951's movie, David and Bathsheba. Are you all familiar with that one? Gregory Peck, Susan Hayward. In that movie, the two conspire together. It's like they had a long-going relationship that led to Uriah's death and what happens after that. That is a part of what was the story that was being told by that time. I was talking to a close friend of mine. She was the daughter of the pastor at the church where I grew up, and really was an important part of my mentor in my early ministry. And I told her what I was talking about, and she said, Dad always thought that Bathsheba seduced David. Even my mentor, thinking along those lines. But that's what we got in mind, and perhaps already some of you in the back of your minds are already thinking, well, why did she go to the palace? Why didn't she try to get away from him? These are all questions we keep in the back of mind when we hear that somebody's been abused. Why didn't they do something? And in many ways, that's what people want to say about Bathsheba, thinking that David can't be all the guilt involved in this. In his book, The Violence of Scripture, Eric Siebert says, a woman is at fault for what a man has chosen to do, taking away his responsibility and blaming the victim. Again, blaming Bathsheba to save David. Now, realize that this is not the only story in the Old Testament where a woman has been abused. The Old Testament is full of these stories, realizing that women were seen no more as property, and so they're just simply told, but yet when you read back, it horrifies us today. We would hope that we know better today, but as I see Barbara's back there, as she shared earlier, it's still happening. Victim blaming in the church today. One writer states that David was Bathsheba's Harvey Weinstein. The one who wielded power, brought Bathsheba into his palace, and did what he wanted to with her. And if you're familiar with the Harvey Weinstein stories in Hollywood, what he did to many people. But we see in turning around often, again, people want to save the institution over the person. If it wasn't for the Me Too movement that was going on at the time when Harvey Weinstein was brought out, he would have probably easily covered it up. And we've heard other stories that are probably similar to Harvey Weinstein. Those questions I talked about earlier, we ask too often of the victims. What did you do to encourage it? What were you wearing? Why did you go to? And why didn't you yell or try to get away? Why is it we want to ask these questions? One writer says it's because we want to feel safe ourselves. If we avoid doing these things will not happen to us. But sadly, they will. quoting Kristen Dumez in her book, Jesus and John Wayne. The evangelical cult of masculinity links patriarchal power to masculine aggression and sexual desire. Its counterpoint is submissive femininity. Folks, this emphasis on submission leads to many women and children being abused. We have to get past this ideal. Now, in saying that, why this can easily lead to abuse, do realize that abuse happens not only in more fundamentalist churches, it happens in moderate churches, it happens in progressive churches. But yet this ideology in fundamentalist churches leads to doors being opened to abuse. To look at this ideal of femininity, Bathsheba is the one who's at fault because she was the one that didn't protect David from being tempted by her. And that's exactly what we say sometimes even today. Krista Brown, in her book Baptist Land, a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation, is probably one of the best books that talks about how she was groomed as a young teenager. She had problems in her family. Her youth minister used this as an opportunity to begin grooming her. And all during the abuse, the youth minister was telling her this was a part of God's will until he decided that he needed to end it and then called her a tool of Satan. Susan was my wife Susan's here. As I was working through this book, she heard me get mad because this happens so easily in churches, such stories as this. Then those who are abused in church are sometimes asked to forgive their abuser or asked for forgiveness for being abused. And then in a lot of mindsets, well, Jesus washes us clean of our sins, and thus that's all we need to say about it. For the last part of this, I'm going to use a case study of abuse and how a denomination had to be challenged to deal with it, and that is a case study with the Southern Baptist Convention. Southern Baptist Convention was my church home for my first 30 years of my life, and still have a great affinity for it. But in 2022, was released a report on sexual abuse in Southern Baptist churches. They did not do the study themselves. Instead, they hired an outside agency to do it, Guidepost. Even at this, Krista Brown, who I mentioned earlier, tried 20 years to get the Southern Baptist Convention to do this. It was only after the Houston Chronicle ran an article naming names and putting pictures in the article that the Southern Baptist Convention reacted to it. Now, realize in Southern Baptist life, due to its polity, what they were saying is, we as a convention cannot tell the local church what to do. Southern Baptist Convention is an entity within itself. The state conventions are an entity within themselves, what we call the local association. And the local church decides which group it will be a part of. And thus they said, we can't do this because it is a local church issue. Even though if you've been reading the news, Southern Baptist Convention has just recently kicked out several churches for having women pastors. They've been against it all along, the current leadership of it. One church that I'm very familiar with, my brother was minister of music there, the woman pastor had been there 30 years, and they hadn't acted upon it in 30 years. But yet they quickly kick a church out for having a woman pastor, but they will try to avoid kicking a church out or dealing with a church that is known to have abuse happening within it. That's my side story. Some call this study a satanic scheme. It takes us away from evangelism. And that's the big thing in Southern Baptist life, is evangelism. You've got to go out and save the lost. My friends, people who are abused are lost in the sense of they're not in the relationship where they need to be because of what someone else has done to them. When the report came out, it had 703 names on it. 409 of them were still serving in Southern Baptist churches. Now add this to it. In churches, 70% of people who've been abused will not report it. So imagine multiplying that number if they were all reported. Still, there's opposition to this. They had budgeted money in the Southern Baptist Convention for it, for doing this study, and for starting a list of known abusers. But opposition emerged. The executive committee would not release the $4 million to support this. And legal ramifications made them step back because the Southern Baptist Convention could be held liable, again, saving the institution, could be held liable for all abuses that happened that they were aware of. And if you, again, watch the news, one of the leaders of the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, a judge from Texas who just passed away, the Southern Baptist Convention had to pay a major payout for all the male boys that he had abused. And so this is what they're thinking. It's going to cost us money. Sadly, churches make too many of their decisions on how much it's going to cost instead of the right thing to do. And again, they were still saying it's a distraction from the Lord's work. Again, blaming Bathsheba in order to save David. Now, some of the suggestions I have. First off, I saw Barbara here. This created to thrive, cultivating abuse-free faith communities. I wish I'd known that when I was doing my work. I may post this from a theological prospect, but what she suggested in her session earlier, and you'll need to look that up if you weren't at that, was a way of helping the church deal with abuse within the church. As I say, a lot of churches run away from it, but I really appreciated what you shared earlier today, Barbara. Some of the suggestions I have, and these are just suggestions. First off, the church must be a safe place for those who are abused to be able to come forward. Most churches are not. Again, they will blame the victim, and the victim often becomes the outcast instead of the perpetrator. The second thing that I found in my study that needs to be done is local authorities need to be a part of this process. When abuse is found out and is verified within the church, local authorities need to be made known of it. Why do I say that? Because a lot of churches don't want to bring in the local authorities because it will bring in publicity, and thus that minister will go to another church, and another church, and another church. But with a criminal record, that's one method that they can use to look up for a criminal background check. If you do not bring in the local authorities, it will not show up on a criminal background check. So this is very important as well. And then victims of abuse need to be given a voice within the church. And this is what several writers shared, the importance of the abused to share within the church because it opens doors to others who have faced abuse. And we need to be careful about our not deciding what they need to say in church, but give them a voice themselves to share what has happened. And a book I'm working through right now is excellent for that. Hanson's book, Speaking of Rape, The Limits of Language in Sexual Violation. It is an excellent book because it teaches people that sometimes the words we have do not fully explain for the person who is the victim. Highly recommend this book. Well, that's all I have. Let me go on. If you want PowerPoint or you want the bibliography, there's my address. I want to open the floor for words, comments, questions. Yes.